Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if we really understand what it means to be left-wing or liberal? Do we actually have good ways to measure it? Or are we just guessing? Well, this massive new study dives deep into that very question. Today we're talking about a super comprehensive look at how scientists have been trying to measure left-wing ideas for almost 100 years. It is a huge study looking at over 1.5 million articles and more than 2.5 million people. They wanted to see if the tools we use to understand political beliefs are actually any good. So why is this important? Well, how we understand people's political beliefs helps us understand a lot about society. Think about it. Labels like left-wing or liberal are used all the time. But the researchers here pointed out that these labels can be really broad and might hide a lot of different values and thoughts. Most of the time, when scientists study political beliefs, they just use a single question. Like, are you left or right on a scale of 1 to 10? It is easy, but is it accurate? Interestingly, a lot of research in this area has focused on conservative ideas, rather than left-wing ones. This means we might be missing a big part of the picture. If you only measure one side, you might accidentally think the other side is just the opposite, which isn't always true. Left-wing ideas, like wanting equality or progress, are complex and have their own unique histories and beliefs. So, to get a handle on this, the researchers did a massive review. They went through thousands of studies published over many decades, from the 1930s all the way to 2023. They looked at how different left-wing ideas were measured. They focused on 8 specific areas: general political orientation, operational ideology, which is about specific issues, feminism, environmentalism, egalitarianism, the idea of equality communism, something called left-wing authoritarianism, and progressivism. Their method was pretty straightforward but incredibly thorough. They searched scientific databases for studies that measured these political ideas. They used keywords like left-wing, liberal, feminism, environmentalism, and paired them with words like attitude, belief, or ideology, and then with words for measurement tools like scale, measure, or questionnaire. Imagine throwing a really big net to catch as many relevant studies as possible. After a lot of filtering and checking, they ended up with 1,899 articles. That is still a lot, but it means they were really careful about what they included. Then 8 researchers meticulously went through each of those 1,899 articles. They pulled out key details, where the people in the study were from, what kind of people they were, like students or the general public, how many people there were, what the measurement tool was called, if it was one question or many, and if the researchers checked if the tool was reliable, meaning it gives consistent results. Now, let's get to the juicy findings. One of the first things they noticed was a huge bias in who was being studied. Most of the research, a whopping 77%, came from just 4 countries: the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. They call these weird countries Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Over 90% of all the people studied were from these countries. This is a big deal because it means our understanding of left-wing ideas might be really skewed towards a very specific group of people. Our global understanding of these ideas might be pretty limited, or even wrong. On top of the geographical bias, most studies didn't even use representative samples of the general population. They often use university students. And sometimes, especially in studies about feminism, there was a strong skew towards having more female participants. Now, about the actual measurement tools. The results showed that for most of these left-wing ideas, the most common way to measure them is with just a single question. For general political orientation, like how left or right are you, a stunning 93% of studies use just one item. Even when they used single questions, there wasn't even agreement on how to ask it. Different studies used 5-point scales, 7-point scales, 9-point scales, 11-point scales, even scales with 10 or 11 points. This makes it super hard to compare results across different studies. The studies that did use multiple items, which are generally better for measuring complex ideas, were more common for things like feminism and environmentalism. But even then, the researchers found a lot of fragmentation. Here is a really critical finding, even when they used multi-item scales. Very few studies actually checked if those scales worked well. Only about 2% reported doing original validation work for their scales. That means they often just took existing scales, maybe tweaked them a bit, or even made them up on the spot, what they call ad hoc scales. It is a bit more hopeful that in recent years, starting around 2010, there has been more attention paid to validating these measures. But it is still quite low overall. Looking at how things have evolved, the single-item left-right scale for political orientation has been king for a long time, especially in the last 20 years. It is just easy to use. For feminism, some older, more specific scales have become less popular. Instead, studies are increasingly using scales that ask about self-identification as a feminist, or how much someone identifies with the feminist movement, rather than measuring specific feminist beliefs or values. For environmentalism, the long-standing new environmental paradigm scale used to be the go-to. But like with feminism, there is a growing trend towards measuring general environmental concern or identification with the environmental movement, often with scales that aren't super well defined. Interestingly, constructs like left-wing authoritarianism and progressivism are newer areas of study, and they're starting to see more sophisticated multi-item measures, which is a good sign for left-wing authoritarianism. They've even adapted tools used to measure right. Wing authoritarianism and created new, more detailed scales. When it comes to operational ideology, which covers specific social and economic issues, the picture is really messy. There are many different ways of measuring these attitudes, and they often don't line up theoretically or psychometrically. This means that findings from one study might not be comparable to another, because they're measuring slightly different things. Similarly, for egalitarianism, there aren't many established measurement tools, making research hard to compare. And for communism, while there was some early interest, there haven't been many significant developments in measurement tools. To get a feel for how these ideas have changed over time and relate to each other, the researchers used fancy computer analysis. They mapped out the words used in all the measurement items into a kind of meaning space. This showed that feminism and egalitarianism were among the first ideas studied. Environmentalism popped up later, and then progressivism and left. Wing authoritarianism really only started to appear more frequently in the last decade or so. They also looked at how similar the meanings of the words in different ideological scales are. What they found was that progressivism, interestingly, seems to be conceptually close to many other left-wing ideas. It acts like a central hub, feminism and environmentalism. On the other hand, tend to be more separate. This suggests that progressivism might be a way to frame older left-wing ideas in a more modern and acceptable way. So, what is the big takeaway from all of this? The study highlights a really serious problem. Our current ways of measuring left-wing ideology are often too simple, too fragmented, and not well validated. We rely too much on single questions for broad ideas like political orientation. For newer or more nuanced concepts, we're starting to develop better tools, but it is still early days. The lack of clear, standardized measures means it is hard to compare research across different studies. It is like trying to compare apples and oranges because no one agrees on what an apple even is in some cases. The researchers are calling for better measurement tools. They need to be multidimensional, meaning they capture different aspects of an ideology, be driven by strong theories about what these ideologies actually are, and be sensitive to different cultures. We can't assume that what liberal means in the US is the same as in India or Brazil. And that geographical bias we talked about, it is a major limitation. If most of your research is done in weird countries, you are missing out on how left-wing ideas actually play out in the rest of the world, where they might be mixed with very different cultural and political ideas. They also point out that the content of these scales changes over time. What we consider important in left-wing thought today might be different from 50 years ago. This evolution is normal, but it means we need to be careful not to use outdated measures. The computer analysis of the words used in the scales showed this evolution clearly. For example, in feminism, the focus has shifted from things like workplace equality and structural critique to more about feminist identity. This study is really strong because it was systematic, meaning they had a clear plan and followed it closely. They also looked back through a huge amount of time so they could see trends. But like any study, it has limitations. They might have missed some papers if the titles or keywords didn't match their search terms exactly. Also, the search terms were based on existing language, so maybe newer or less common ways of talking about these ideas weren't fully captured. So, what is the big final thought? This is the first big review of how we measure left-wing ideas, and it shows we have a long way to go. We need better, more nuanced tools that reflect the real complexity and diversity of these ideologies, not just in Western countries, but everywhere. It is pretty clear that relying on single questions is like trying to understand a person by asking them just one question. It gives you a tiny sliver of information, but you are missing the vast majority of who they are. Moving forward, researchers need to invest more time and effort into developing and validating scales that can truly capture the richness of these political belief systems. We need to move beyond just asking people to label themselves and start understanding the deeper values, beliefs, and motivations that shape their political views. This is crucial for both scientific understanding and for building more informed and inclusive societies, and that's our dive into the psychometrics of left-wing ideology. What do you think about the way we measure political beliefs? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this interesting, please give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science deep dives, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.